You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 41. My name is Sean Wildemuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. On today's show, I have Carl Franklin. Carl is the Executive Vice President of vNext, a software development firm helping to bring about the Internet of Things revolution. Carl is a 20-plus year veteran of the software industry, co-host, and founder of .NET Rocks, the first and most widely listened to podcast for .NET developers. He's also a Microsoft MVP for Kinect for Windows, a Microsoft Regional Director, a senior executive at Pwop Studios, a full-service audio and production and post-production studio located in Southeastern Connecticut. Carl has been a leader in the .NET community since 2002 and in the Visual Basic community before then. In the very early days, he wrote for Visual Basic Programmers Journal, authoring the Q&A column of that magazine, as well as many other feature articles for VBPJ and other magazines. He's authored 2 books for John Wiley Sons on socket programming and VB, and in 1984, he helped create the very first website for VB developers, Carl and Gary's VB homepage. Today's episode is a little different than we've done before. Sure, we're going to delve into Carl's beginnings like we have with most of our guests, but Carl and I are both musicians and programmers, so we want to talk about that connection as well as what Carl's up to these days. Let's take a listen. Today, I'm excited. I've been trying to get our schedules synced up in order to get Carl Franklin on the show, and here he is. How are you doing,
Sean?
Carl?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. And are you home these days?
Yeah, I've been home a lot more this year than in years past. Usually I'm gallivanting around the world with Richard Campbell doing conferences and road trips and all sorts of things. But only a few of those conferences have sort of gone away this year for us anyway.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're having fun?
Oh, yeah. I always have fun.
That's true.
I'm spending a lot more time developing, actually. I've got a couple of projects going. And I've just been trying to put into practice a lot of stuff that I've been listening to over the past years that I've sort of dabbled in. I'm sort of now jumping into full force. So that's a lot of fun for me.
And you just did a Kickstarter for Music to Code By. Do I have the title right?
That's right. Yeah. That was just blows my mind how that happens.
It was fun to watch it, even down to the last, 20 minutes or so.
So you want the story of that? Because I would love to. It's a pretty interesting story. We were talking on .NET Rocks with Mark Seaman in Norway at the NDC, the Norwegian Developers Conference, and his topic was getting into the zone. And, there's actual books about this and a lot of experts, of which I am not. So about, alpha waves or whatever, the getting into that state of mind where you're just sort of flowing and things, you have direct, almost like a faster access to your brain. Your brain is alert, your body is at rest, and you're just in the zone, right?
Well, that's the technical term I've always used.
Yeah, I'm trying to describe without the benefit of having done all this research and knowing what I'm talking about, but that's essentially what it is. So the conversation turned to techniques to get in and out, or, get into the zone quicker so that you can not destroy yourself, staying up all night, that kind of stuff, which is what I used to do.
Sure.
And I'm sure a lot of us have too. Some still do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then it turned to music, and we talked about kinds of music that help people focus.
Wow.
And we all agreed that instrumental music was best because anything that, is talking to you or singing, we're just naturally prone to pay attention to it. We're programmed to.
Sure.
Yeah. So that led to this idea where I would just do some instrumental music for focusing. And like most things, I have a general idea of what I'm going to do before before I do it, but I have an overwhelming feeling that it'll be successful, like that I'll be able to pull it off. So I did a Kickstarter campaign for this music, and I asked for $7,500, which would cover my cost of my time that would otherwise be spent writing code and making money.
Yeah.
And also the cost of production and all that stuff, which is less, but then I raised $10,000 in 30 days.
Wow. And so is it unfair to call you, the programmer's version of Enya? I mean,
I don't know. You'll have to find out. I never wanted it to be new age or ambient.
Oh, sure.
Listening to Brian Eno's Music for Airports, which I've known about Brian Eno for a long time. I'm a huge fan. Of course, he produced Talking Heads and then later U2, and has done a lot of ambient music. But that's not what I'm after. I'm after something with a steady beat, something with a groove that isn't, there's a lot of stuff that's out there that's sort of instrumental groove, chill music. But a lot of it, they try to make hooky melodies and sounds that grab your attention. And so it's going to be a challenge to make something that isn't boring, that's engaging, that isn't distracting. So that's my challenge.
And part of it, well, I would imagine, I don't know anything about the science of it, but there's an energy to it that obviously none of that stuff is really going for. It's this,
right.
When I'm programming, it's not the soft, sweet instrumental music that I'm drawn to. It's something that sort of keeps me driven, even if I'm not cognitively aware of what's going on in my head around it. But it's something that it can't be super brand new music. Otherwise, I'll pay attention. It can't be if there's lyrics, they can't be lyrics I haven't heard before, because that's just destructive.
Right, and so you want something that in the first 4-8 bars is going to repeat, so that you get familiar with it immediately, and then you can sort of just let it morph. And that's sort of what I'm after. I'm after stuff that slowly morphs, but there will be cues in it to let you know every 5 minutes that it's changed. Pretty significantly. And I also am going to make an attempt to map it to Pomodoros. So the Pomodoro technique. Good. Yeah. So I'll make 3 Pomodoros of music, maybe with an intro. Yeah.
Cause that technique's been very useful for me.
Yeah. A lot of us. It's a wonderful technique for time management.
So this brings me to sort of the question of, I wanted to have you on the show because I think there's a lot of developers who may have started the way you did, which is this weird mix of not only computers, but also music. And there seems to be a lot of musician developers out there, most of them not as accomplished as you, obviously, but I think there's a pattern there.
That remains to be seen, but
that's the right thing you're supposed to say, but yeah.
It's true. I don't claim to be the best musician in the world. There's millions of people that run circles around me.
Sure.
That's not what I'm after anyway. I've obviously thought a lot about this because it comes up again and again on the show and in conversations that I have with developers. That I even heard one manager say he only hires musicians, particularly guitar player developers, just because they just tend to be better developers and more productive, more creative, think outside the box, they struggle less. And I can't say with any kind of certainty that that's real. It could be just correlation. It doesn't mean causation. And but I don't know. I started playing piano when I was 5 or 4 and started singing in the local choir when I was 8. I was singing like, a boy soprano kind of Beethoven symphonies and Bach and all this stuff with the community chorus of Westerly, Rhode Island. And started playing guitar when I was about 11 or 10. Actually, I was 10, yeah. And then that's always been a part of my life. Computers obviously didn't come in until I was in high school, and my father brought home a TRS-80, and I just thought it was really fun to play with, and taught myself how to program in BASIC. But I also taught myself the operating system, like that the computer had an OS manual that also had a lot of programming like things in the batch language. and there was a lot you could do with it. And then it had the basic interpreter built into it as well. So I just sort of had this, these two areas of interest that paralleled. And
did they parallel because you were using the soundboards in the early trash 80s to do that as well, or did it immediately go from one to the other? Or
well, the trash 80, as you said, didn't really have any sound per se. I did buy a speaker that you could plug into it, and I mean plug in. There was a little expansion port on the bottom, and you could snap the speaker onto it. And it was a speech synthesizer, actually. So I had a lot of fun with that. And it was pretty good. I mean, yeah, you could write programs to basically do speech synthesis. It sounded terrible, but,
understandable.
Should I do the speech? I could probably remember it. Hello, Carl Franklin. How are you? It sounded really bad, but but it was fun. And, my friends and I had a lot of good times coming up with stupid things for it to say. Of course, that was the joke of the day.
Right. If once you got it to say all the curse words.
Exactly. Exactly.
That certainly hasn't changed.
You prank phone calls and, have a conversation where you just speak with the computer and people are freaked out on the other side. It's great.
Yeah. Well, I seem to run into two different kinds of musician programmers. Some that sort of like the separation between them, so that what they do, and these are, guitarists typically are sort of in this vein, where it's sort of separated. They like the idea of something that's fairly analog in their music, and it isn't a computer job in order to make the music. And then there's this other type that, is all into sequencers and doing all these fancy things with building these layers of sounds using keyboards and those sorts of things. And not to say that one or the other is better, but it is a different mindset, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a lot of musicians that just know a few chords on guitar, and they're happy with that, that's all they really have time for. They started playing later in life and picked up guitar, learned a few chords, and, let's face it, it's a struggle if you're doing that later in life. And that's pretty much as you can manage with the time that you have, especially if you have a job in IT and a family and all that stuff. I mean, it's hard to find the time to practice. So
absolutely.
With me, it was different though. I mean, I was doing music all my life. So it didn't take me long. I think it was a PC XT clone that I got when I first got a MIDI card, and that was a Voyetra MIDI card and sequencer that I bought at my local music store. I ended up working for Voyetra. They now run Turtle Beach. I believe they bought Turtle Beach, and they have but they had the competitor to Cakewalk. At the time, they were before Cakewalk. They had a DOS-based sequencer and hardware solution, and I immediately got that. And I knew a friend who had a sampling keyboard, a Roland sampling keyboard, I think it was,
with the little floppy drive in it.
Exactly. Yeah. It was after the Mirage. I'm pretty sure the Ensoniq Mirage was one of the first sampling keyboards that sounded pretty good. But this one was after that. So this was probably 87, 86, something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And anyway, I started messing around with that pretty much right away. So that got me into MIDI, and I got into MIDI full force. Like I was a sequencing, it really started for me when I got the Korg M1 music workstation. Somehow I convinced my grandmother to buy it for me, because she was the only one in our family who had that kind of money.
Yeah. It's always grandma, isn't it?
Grandma bought it for me, and I said I would pay her back, but of course I barely did, this was different time, right? It was a different lifetime ago. I was a poor high school student, no job. And anyway, so the Korg M1 had a sequencer in it, but it was kind of clunky to use with the little LCD screen.
Yeah.
So I hooked it up to Sequencer Plus and the Voyetra thing, and you could do 8 different instruments at the same time. And man, I had fun with that. I did so many sequences. I did like some jazz combo sequences.
Nice.
Where you got like horns and upright bass and electric or regular piano and jazz drums, like trying to get the nuances of a really good jazz drummer. And I was just really into that.
Wow.
But I sort of, once I found that there were PCs that were fast enough to do audio recording in real time, in multi-track audio recording, I just sort of, the MIDI just seemed like, no, it sounds cheesy, and I want to get some real instruments and record real music, so that's where I've been ever since.
It's interesting, yeah, because I mean, I used to have one of the little Tascam 4-tracks and all that, because none of the PCs could handle. Right. Even if you could record, hard drive record on one of the early PCs, there was no way you could do any mixing in real time. It was sort of set everything and then have it process for 20 minutes and listen to the 3 minutes. And
so I got a story for you. It was probably 93, 92. I don't know. It was somewhere around there. Yeah, early 90s. So it was either the 386 or a 486, and I can't remember which it was, but there was a company that had a Windows app and a hardware board, and I think it was Microtrack maybe.
Maybe. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, and I was working at Voyetra, and then in my spare time, I was helping this guy in New York City who had a studio on Central Park West, and he was typical of the time. He had all the money to throw into a studio, but none of the brains to operate it. So, I was his right hand guy, and he somehow convinced the dealer to give him a machine, a board or whatever, and he got a machine for it. So, long story short, my brother and I at this little studio recorded a song that's out there today. It's called She Won, and it was on our first album, Strange Communication, but it was done in the early 90s on this Microtrack. The funny thing about it was you could record different tracks and all of that, and you had a metronome, but if you wanted to hear them all together, you had to quote unquote render it. And rendering one song took a half an hour. Yeah. Because if you think of what's going on there, like it just didn't have the power. And this is what, today I pull up Pro Tools or Adobe Audition and I can listen to 20 tracks, 30 tracks all at the same time in real time.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was such a new thing. Yeah.
We can render video faster than we could render audio then.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is just, the amount of data we're pushing is so much smaller. And I'm kind of on the fence about that being a good thing. I mean, it's a great thing. This is awesome. The democratization of recording and all that.
It is really awesome.
Love all of that. But it does make it a little easier to copy paste songs instead of being able to play them anymore. And
I have been such a get off my lawn, give me my royalties guy for the last few years, but my thoughts are changing. I don't, let's face it, musicians, the days of selling music are over, especially at least in the way that you think of as selling music. Like you just can't do it anymore. I mean, if you have a gig, you bring your CDs to the gig and you could probably sell them for $20 just because they're attached to an experience that somebody is having. They're shaking your hand, you're signing it or whatever. That's different. But if, when was the last time any of us went to iTunes and bought an album or bought a single for 99 cents? It just doesn't happen very often anymore. So now streams are the thing.
Yep.
And with streams, you pay, like for Spotify or whatever, you pay $20 a month and you can listen to, right? So they actually do pay artists, but it's microcents.
Yeah.
Yeah, microcents. So what?
All microtransaction now.
Yeah, and an artist that has 10,000 streams might get $1.
Right.
So those days are over. And now I think the focus should be on, and this gets back to my motto, just be awesome. Just if you want to do music, just do music, right? Don't expect to get paid for it. Certainly don't expect to make a living at it, unless you're one of these people that just wants to, beat yourself up and tour and spend a lot of money on gear and not get a lot of money and deal with constant disappointment. Like, and I'm not saying that's because you're not good. I'm saying it's just because people just don't come out to hear bands anymore, especially if you're a new band. I mean, there are exceptions to that rule, but I'm saying for 80% of you, that's the reality. Yeah. So just if you're going to make music, consider it like a boat. It's a hole in the water in which you pour money, and music should be a place in your life that you can invest in. And the end result is music. It's not money. Don't do that for the money, because there is none. And then, someday something might happen.
Right.
But don't count on it.
And I think
I'm pretty cynical, if you can, catch that.
I understand that.
But there are other ways to do it, though. I mean, look what you two just did with the iPhone.
Yeah.
If you're popular, then somebody's going to find a way to give you money for whatever that is. If it's a performance, if it's if you're, if you have music for an event or something like that. But those are transactions that happen between you and the end user, like software developer, not between you and a record company.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think for a lot of us that are in the computer profession, there's some of the musicians that kind of hope that they're going to, hit it big with music and then do this and that. And I spent a couple of years just doing music in my 20s where, I was on the bottom peg of music at the time, but I was still doing music and
you and I were both doing that in our 20s.
Yeah. A meager living, but I was happy. And that's kind of what I took away from that. When I stopped doing it, it was, whenever I play, I want to enjoy playing. And if that's at a club, if that's at an open mic, if that's in my living room with some friends, that's what I want to focus on. Yep. This whole focus on how do I monetize it, sort of pollutes it.
It does.
You start looking for the hook instead of the groove.
Exactly. And get this, even if you were successful at it, it'd be your job. Yeah. It'd be your job.
Yeah. And most of the developers out there know this difference already with development, right? There are those little projects that you have on GitHub that you love. Yep. And then you have to go write reports for the sales organization at your company.
Exactly.
Right? Which are you enjoying?
Right.
And the same thing happens with music.
I totally agree.
So how do you think that, being a musician affects the way you write software? Do you think it wires the mind in certain ways that is beneficial? I know you talked about the boss earlier that said he would only hire a guitarist, but I wonder what that's about. All right.
So I have made some observations and people have told me things and I've come to some conclusions. And here's basically what I think. I think there are certain parallels in the way that you think and approach music and software at the same time. So first of all, let's think of patterns. Mm-hmm. All right. And let's talk about guitar. When you play guitar, there are different positions that you play in if you're playing notes, right? Chords are positions in and of themselves, and there are chord patterns. And we have names for them. A 1-6-2-5 is your typical 50s slow dance O'Donna song, right?
Right.
And that's because you have the root, the 6th chord, the 2 minor chord, and then the 5th, and it just repeats. And so those are patterns that musicians, when they're communicating, this is the way they say, oh, it's a 1-6-2-5 in E flat at about, 100 beats per minute. Right. That we know how to do that. Okay, good. Let's go run and play it. Or it's a blues in E. That's a pattern. So you have patterns that we also have. And that just is a natural byproduct of abstraction. And abstraction, of course, is taking something that's very technically difficult and sort of reducing it to something that's more approachable for your mind to wrap its head around. So music doesn't exist except in our mind, and software doesn't exist except in our mind. I mean, we're arranging electrons in memory and telling the circuits to go follow the path, right? I mean, that's essentially what we're doing. But we have these layers of abstraction to make that a lot easier. And in music, we have abstractions notation is sort of equivalent to the source code of music.
Right.
Notation is a language which we use to communicate intent for how this music should be played, how it should be expressed, and nuances like you wouldn't believe. And of course, recording is the same way.
Yeah.
But so you have these abstractions and you have patterns. When you play scales, you're in different positions. This is what I was getting to at first. You're in different positions and you're playing different patterns of sequences of notes. And that is essentially that's what you're doing. Now here's the most interesting correlation that I've seen, that I've heard about. And I got to give kudos to my friend Steve Walker for telling me this years ago. He said, when you practice, let's say it's guitar, when you're practicing a lick or a riff, I don't care what it is, you got your favorite song and there's a riff or a lick. It's hard, right? You have to slow it down. You have to break it down into subtle movements that you have to practice and get very technical as far as how this is going to work in the minutia level. All right. Likewise, when you're in the middle of a project and you have to develop a routine, maybe it's a recursive routine, maybe it's some functional thing, or maybe it's just a routine to, take some entities and persist them to a database or do some checking or whatever. You're down at a very technical level, sort of assembling, and getting things ready to run. Right. You're sort of doing the same detail work, but at the same time, as a musician, you need to zoom out and see the big picture, which is the musical composition that you're going to put forth. And as a developer, you need to zoom out and see, how does what I'm doing here fit into the big picture, into the application? Because ultimately the end user is going to run the application just like the end user is going to listen to a piece of music.
Yeah, and that the end user of the music does not need to understand the 1-4-5 pattern,
exactly,
or the which scale you're using in the solo to enjoy it. In the same way, users of software obviously don't need to understand the minutia of, is this C# or Java, or
exactly,
is this recursive or functional? They don't care,
right? And so if you think about it, the person, the musician that can practice and mess up and fail and learn from that failure and then adapt is going to be better, faster than the person who plays it, expects miracles, and then says, I can't do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that's a life lesson that all of us have to learn at some point, that failure isn't an end point.
Yeah, and it's the same with programming, is that,
absolutely,
if you get frustrated in the technique, in the technical details that obviously come with practice and come with experience, then you won't be as good as fast. And the developers that can jump around from technical details, the big picture to the middle, like you always know where you are in the big picture when you're working on an app, and keep those things in your mind. Those are the guys that tend to be better, that don't need all the framework, the protective framework of, coding, test first or whatever. They just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of a pragmatism about that, I think.
Yeah.
And I find in both disciplines, there's this idea of understanding how it works so that I can not worry about how it works.
Yeah.
Learning that riff over and over again, understanding all the notes, where they fit into the chord structure and all that, are important when you're learning it. But in the moment when you're writing the code or when you're playing the riff with other musicians or on stage or just for your family, whatever it is, there's that moment where all of that goes away. I'm not thinking, that's the third, that's the fifth, that's the minor fourth. I'm just in the moment. And that happens I think in development once you're not afraid to fail.
You totally nailed that. Man, I couldn't have said that better. And that is exactly right, Sean. When you're learning, that's when you're thinking. When you're playing, you're not thinking. You're learning and practicing a guitar anyway, and I'm sure piano and all these other instruments are the same. You're creating muscle memory You're training your fingers to respond to your impulses, your emotional impulses. And so that when you play, and it's especially true with improvisation, when you play, you don't think, you just say, I want to, sort of shape this music to have this emotion, and you don't stop and think, well, how would I do that technically? I would just, I want a third and a fifth and blah. There are people who do that, but I think the best improvisers can just use their sixth sense and let their muscle memory take over.
And I think certainly the same thing happens in development.
I agree. Yeah.
I noticed something. I was at a TED Talk here in Dublin the other day, and they were talking about, success and failure and all this. And it got me to thinking that when I teach development, and I do a lot of live coding for people, and when it goes wrong is when all this interesting stuff happens. And that happens in music for me as well, right? When you don't know what's about to happen, some really amazing things, when you just, when you're just jamming with people or whatever.
Yeah.
When you're playing the song that everybody knows, it's fun. But then when you go, I just came up with this thing, and you try to play over it, that's when the real, fun happens. Because the 34 mistakes, you're going to find the three little nuggets in.
That's right. Yeah. 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 And man, if we had that attitude towards development, and you nailed it when you said not afraid to fail, if we had that exploratory childlike wonder about computers and software, that we just, hey, let's see where this takes me today. And then you might end up saying, that pattern doesn't fit my brain right now, or whatever. You might move on to something else, and something might click.
Yeah. Or you're going to see something that you're going to be able to apply much later, but it may not fit, what you're doing then.
That's right.
There's this other notion around music that I talked about, and I did this little ebook a while back that I was interested in, and that is when I grew up in music, one of the important things, I was a French horn player, was this idea of sight reading.
Tough instrument, by the way. Very hard to nail.
Stacy, the first chair, was unbelievably adorable, and that's why I took such a tough instrument. Yeah, I'm willing to admit why. Yeah. But this notion of sight reading has always felt like if we could bring that into development, this idea that, okay, here's a new piece of code. Can you understand what's going on without starting up the debugger?
The difference is we have one notation system in music, and we have 9,000 in computers. And even within a language like C#, you've got different styles and you've got different patterns that apply. So one piece of C# music is not going to look like another piece of C# music, much more than a score is going to look like another score. You have much more variance. So my thing about sight reading is that in order to do it well, you have to study for a long time, and it's a skill like any other skill that takes a lot of practice to do. And I'm not going to say that it hinders the right part, the right side of your brain. I'm not going to say that, but it always felt that way to me. And when I see people who've spent their life learning how to read music and interpret it, they don't improvise as well. And then just because it uses the left side of your brain much, much more than it, because again, the sheet music is telling you what to feel and how you should feel, instead of your natural impulses telling you how this music should feel. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. And
yeah, so the source code is driving it instead of you.
It's true. I'm sure this is colored by the fact that I'm an old man, right?
Yeah.
So when I started doing development, that was the only way you could understand code, because, debuggers didn't exist. I remember early in Windows development, which was a good 10 years into my development life, or maybe 6 or 7. I don't remember the number.
Yep. That's all we had.
Message box was my debugger, right?
Yep.
Oh, what is the state of this? What is the state of this? Because I didn't have any way to actually walk through code. And so when I see people look at code and like, I don't know what it's doing, how can you not?
So think of it this way. In the early days of music, especially in Europe, the instruments that they had were so much harder to play because they didn't understand the dynamics between, human and instrument as well as they do today.
Sure.
And so, some of these, like in old instruments, like the sack butt, are just like ridiculously hard to play. Like they require inhuman amounts of constant air pressure, and the embouchure has to be just right. And some of these instruments just went away. And there's actually a society of musicians called the Early Music Society that learns pieces written for these instruments on these old instruments.
Wow.
That barely exist anymore. And the reason is good reason, because you can't freaking play them, right? It's very hard. So the technology grew closer to the human and what the human was capable of expressing. And that same thing is happening in a big way, much, much faster on the computer side, right? I mean, you're
Sure.
right. I remember using soft dice to develop in C++. And,
yes.
And yeah, I mean, you felt like you were constantly on your toes to make sure you had the right syntax. There was no IntelliSense or anything. It was you and essentially Notepad,
Yeah.
And if you didn't get it right, you had to compile it, run it, and then probably see some error that wasn't even meant for you. It was meant for the compiler people to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you forgot the one step of, resetting the OS.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The OS could barely keep up with it too. I mean, talk about, oh man, pain. Yeah. Languages have gotten so much closer to us and so much more expressive.
Yeah.
That we can be afraid to fail. And we know that it's going to take, especially in a managed environment like Java or C# or .NET, right? Or
right.
VBNet, you can't really mess it up. You can blow
kill a computer.
You can't really kill the computer. Yeah, you can't. It's in its own little space. Yeah. Not only is it in its own process, it's in its own little software application layer process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
App everyone's, keeping us app domain. There was the word.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's kind of an interesting space. To go back to one of the other things you had mentioned, which I think is important here, and that is, you talked about some developers, learning the 6 chords and enjoying that, but that was about how much they could do, which is interesting because if you sort of look at guys that just want to be able to play rock music at cookouts, right?
Right.
6 chords is probably all you need.
That's true.
Maybe 8, but there's so much of that, especially popular music, that you don't need to know, the stuff in depth. And that's kind of true in development these days. Guys that want to be the working developer but have a life, not the guys like me that, feel like they want to always be learning and that sort of thing. That, there's not a better or worse. It's just, different needs.
Yep.
Them understanding C# and the way that Visual Studio works, or whatever the mix is in the language and environment they're in, that's enough, and they can do all these amazing things today. You don't have to be a hardware developer to be able to write code anymore. You don't have to manage memory like you used to.
Right.
You have all these things to sort of help, democratize development in some ways, and that I don't think that's a bad thing.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing at all, and it's there's a range of things that you should know, and it's always moving up. It's like there's always a new thing you can forget today, because so back in the old days you needed to know all the low level stuff because and here's the 4 magic words: when things go wrong. Right. I mean, it's like anybody. If you're an auto mechanic and you break down on the side of the road, you have knowledge and you have tools to fix it yourself. You don't have to wait for AAA or whatever, dad to come rescue you or whatever.
Sure.
That's the thing, being able to think critically about what is this problem, and then being able to solve it without relying on other people. I mean, and that's really what it comes down to. It's been fascinating to me because as technology has progressed, there's stuff that I can forget, but knowing what that is, I think is tough because nobody tells you.
No. was looking at some code. I'm trying to remember where it was, but they were, there was a line about worrying about the interrupts. And I was like, I don't remember the last time I was worried about when I built a computer, whether I had enough interrupts.
Oh, interrupt conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah. Interrupt conflicts. I remember doing that all the time.
That's such a 90s problem.
It really was. I mean, that wasn't even a development problem. That was dip switches on cards and ISA ports and all that.
And jumpers on motherboards.
Nasty. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, when was the last time you took a jumper shunt off a motherboard?
When was the last time I saw a motherboard? I think is the more important part, right? Yeah,
but I mean, you and I, we were the generation where if you wanted a computer, you built it, otherwise you paid 3 times as much for it.
Yeah.
And so, so we had to do that stuff.
We certainly did.
We sound old today.
Did. Well, that's I don't know if you get this, but that's the nature of the broadcast. I just had Kathleen Dollard on, and she wouldn't do it because she was afraid of sounding old. I'm like, I've talked to 30-year-olds that sound old on the show. It's the nature of the program.
So I'm at a disadvantage to know, what is necessary to learn today if you're just coming up as a developer, right? So, and I'm actually going through this right now with one of my kids. Has done a little HTML in school, wants to go learn programming. Yeah. But there's so many things that I know that help me as a programmer that don't have anything to do with programming, about the computer and about stuff, just maintenance stuff and how internet things work and firewalls and ports and you know what I'm saying?
I do.
There's some stuff that they don't ever need to know, but guess what? Someday they might, or they're going to have to enlist the help of somebody else.
Yeah.
So how much time should they spend on learning that stuff that they might need to know? I am of the mind now that I don't think they should. I think you should learn how to, and kids today should learn how to search and find answers to things they don't know. Learn how to have that conversation with themselves. What do I need to know? I need to know that. In order to know that, I need to know this in order to, and go down to the thing that you know, and then start there. All right, what is that all about? And Google Bing it, and find it.
Yeah.
And learn how to teach yourself what you don't know in order to do what you need to do. And I think that is probably the skill of the 21st and 22nd and beyond centuries that we had to learn the hard way, but I think it's going to be critical for anybody else. You don't need to carry it all in your head. You just need to know where it is when you need it.
Yeah. Cause I no longer can carry any of it in my head.
I don't have any head anymore. My head's gone.
This has been a really great conversation. Where do you go from here? Obviously you're doing the music project, but you're also doing more development. What does that mean to you? Is this something you thought you were past?
No. I'm fascinated by coding and programming and making the computer do magical things that blow people away. That's really what I like to do. I like to do things that surprise people, with development. Right now, I'm starting a new venture called vNext, which is a software development shop.
Nice.
And I'm basically finding all the expert programmers in the world that can tolerate working with me and putting together a team of experts and developing not only our own software, but some open source projects and developing software for the next thing, which is IoT, the Internet of Things.
I'm still not convinced, but...
about the Internet of Things?
Yeah.
That's just programming.
I know.
It is. It's just that there are going to be a lot of devices out there that we need to talk to.
The Internet of Things does make me feel like an old man, because there's part of me when the iWatch, I'm not going to call it an Apple Watch. When the iWatch was announced, I watched, really interested in, like, I want to be convinced that this is a kind of device I need.
Yeah.
I want to be convinced. And I don't wear a watch. I haven't worn a watch, since my Casio calculator watch was put away when I was 18, right? Well, and I figured out that was the key to not dating, is to not have that watch.
I agree that in the personal space, that though the Internet of Things for you personally probably, is going to be a low part of the market. And there'll probably be a few players like there are now. But I think that the bigger thing is in industry and in government and in civic life, that in I'll just give you an example. I mean, the oil rigs, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff on oil rigs that we can measure, and a lot of it that isn't being measured, or is being measured by hand by people at particular intervals that could be measured constantly.
Right.
And then once we have that, the data being measured, we can see patterns and recognize patterns in that data that indicate problems way before they're going to be a problem. So that's just one thing. I mean, but there are so many applications in vertical markets for sensors on things and in places that where we can gather data. That gathering data is the easy part, making sense of it and analyzing it and having it tell us things and having it speak to us. That's the real key to IoT.
Well, I can't disagree with that at all. I think that makes a lot of sense. It does sound like IoT plus big data is the next wave.
Oh, IoT is big data. Yeah.
They have to be together.
Yeah. The devices out there communicating, that's done technology. It's cheap. Yeah, that's easy. The security is a big deal, of course.
Of course.
But yeah, it's all about big data.
Very interesting. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. This is going to be a very entertaining podcast, I hope.
I hope so. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. It was always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World Podcast at hwpod.com.